Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today we're going to go over my 1980s TBR. So with all of my century reads, I'm going to start out this video with a little bit of a history lesson. So, 1980s. I am finally alive in a decade that I am going to read. I was born in 1984, so excitement, I'm finally alive. Technology did some crazy shit in the 1980s. This is where we get like the big computer boom, as far as like personalized computers. Like computers have existed, but this is where we start getting like PCs instead of just computers. The World Wide Web, or the internet, was invented in 1989, or it was probably invented earlier, but it went like worldwide online in 1989. We also had video game consoles pop up in the 1980s with like the Atari, things like that. There's a whole list of them that I don't remember off the top of my head. So you get the Atari plus some other ones that are completely irrelevant because the Atari was the most popular one. There you go. Now, the 1980s were probably better than the 1970s. That was a nightmare of a freaking decade, but it still wasn't good. The AIDS epidemic became a recognized thing in the 1980s, where a lot of homosexual men and drug users were being infected with HIV, and society took this as a time to blame homosexual men for a lot of its ills, as they were one of the main communities affected by this disease. A lot of horrible people used it as a sign that there's something wrong with homosexual men because they were unfortunately the prevalent community with AIDS at the time. Modern times we know that literally anybody can get AIDS. It is not limited to homosexual men or even men. But in the 80s, people were kind of assholes. It happens. People are still assholes. In 1989, we also had the Tiananmen Square protest, which I will stick the really famous picture right here so you know what that is. Interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure that Chinese media still denies that that event ever happened. So, communism. Fun. And the 1980s was the final decade of the Cold War. Now, there's a bunch of other shit that happened in the 80s, but those are just some highlights. And normally from here I go into what like major literature things happened in the 1980s. But by the time we hit the 1980s, literature is so prevalent that there's no real theme. Like this is like the first decade where it's like there's so many different types of books and people are reading all different genres that the 80s doesn't have a literature theme. It's just read whatever the fuck you want to. And my TBR this month is going to reflect that because I've got some weird and wacky shit on this TBR, which we're going to get into right now. So first up, for 1981, I could not do the 80s without reading a trashy romance novel. And for that, I am reading an Indecent Obsession by Colleen McCullough. I'm kind of sad because this doesn't look like most of my trashy romance novels. Like, I expect like a paperback with like a smut tab, but this is a hardback. That's just how it came to me, but it's still a trashy romance novel. This has to do with a military hospital in the Pacific Islands, and it's basically like 5 men in a hospital ward, and they have all broken under the stress of war, and they have one nurse, and they're very isolated in their little ward. And apparently one man shows up to this hospital ward, and he's supposed to be broken, but he doesn't seem broken. And when they say, like, broken is quoting from the synopsis of this book. It's just, he is mentally unstable through PTSD is what it means. His PTSD is not as visible as the other patient's PTSD, which doesn't lessen the fact that he has PTSD, but this is the 80s and mental health sucks. But apparently the nurse falls in love with this man, and this is their romance, so we'll see. I'm very concerned about what the fuck's gonna go into this book, because this synopsis is already... Next up for 1982 is I think the only book on this list that I don't have a physical copy of, and that is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This is about Black women in rural Georgia in the early 20th century, so it's historical fiction. It is very powerful, very moving. This won a Pulitzer Prize, so this is like hard-hitting historical fiction type book. Very different from the trashy romance in the year before. Next up, we have a really, really weird book, and I saw it and I just had to read it because it seemed so quintessentially 1980s, and it is Who Killed the Robbins Family, a novel created by Bill Adler and written by Thomas Chastain, and this one is really weird because it doesn't have an ending. If you see right here at the bottom of this book, there is a $10,000 reward if you could solve the crime in this book. So, I think it's page 7 is where it says, I'm just going to read this. Someone will definitely win $10,000 in Who Killed the Robbins Family contest. Will it be you? Here are the rules. To enter, use ordinary paper. Make sure your name and address are clearly printed at the top of each page of your entry. Print or type your answers to the following 5 questions for each of the 8 members of the Robbins family. Tyler Robbins, Evelyn Robbins, Marshall Robbins, Libby Pittman, Lewis Robbins, James Robbins, Cynthia Robbins, and Kansas Robbins. And number 1, who was the killer? 2, where did the murder take place? 3, when did the murder happen? 4, how was the victim killed? And 5, why was the victim killed? And then you answer all questions in order for each member of the family. And then each set of 5 answers must be clearly identified as relating to a single victim. Apparently all of these all the people in the Robbins family were killed, but they were maybe not necessarily killed by the same person for the same reason. And then all entries must be received by April 15th, 1984. And then you just mail it off. And then the prize will be awarded the prize will be awarded for what is, in the sole determination of the judge, the best solution. Therefore, even if you're not 100% sure you're right, you still might come close and win the $10,000. So this is just a really weird thing. This is a first edition print of the book. I wasn't sure if I was going to get a first edition print when I ordered this, because I ordered this off of Thrift Books and it doesn't really give you a whole lot of details, but this was printed later with the solution added to the book. This one, obviously, because it has the contest in it, doesn't have the solution, so I will probably end up looking up the solution online after I finish reading this. But it's just, can you imagine, like, reading a book to mail in a answer sheet to win $10,000 to figure out who committed the crimes? Like, that's so weird, but I just love the idea of it, and it's so very 1980s game show-esque to me. So this one just sounded so much fun. I had to pick it up. Next up for 1984, we're going to go in a completely different direction. So far we've had a romance, we've had historical fiction, we've had mystery / game show, and now we're going fantasy. And this is Legend by David Gemmell. This is the first in his Druss, it's called something, I can't remember the name of the series, but like the main character's name is Druss, and he is a retired warrior in like a D&D universe like thing, who has to return to battle to save the universe. This is like the best type of trash fantasy ever, and it seems so much fun that I have to read it. This isn't my only fantasy this month, but this is the trashiest of the fantasy that I'm reading this month. For 1985, we're switching up genres again, and now we're going into dystopia, and I am reading The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I will be reading The Testaments, which is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale that Margaret Atwood put out like last year in 2019. I hear that The Testaments is not nearly as good as The Handmaid's Tale, but I thought it would be very interesting to read them back to back. I did read this in college, so I do know what this is about. It's just been a while. Basically, this is post-apocalyptic, so dystopian type novel where humanity struggles to reproduce, and women who can get pregnant are handmaids, and they're just used to give birth. They are not wives, but they are very poor, almost enslaved-like creatures whose entire purpose is to have sex with very wealthy men and reproduce. They just have sex, get pregnant, give up the baby to the wife who can't have kids to raise. It is a very icky, gross, rapey culture, but it is very, very well written, and this is like I'm going to say it's a literary classic, but it's a new classic, I guess, because it was written in the 1980s. It's not that old. And we're not done with new genres yet. I told you there was no rhyme or reason to the 80s in literature. Genres are all over the place. So for 1986, I am reading a graphic novel, Watchmen, by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This is a Hugo Award-winning novel. This is very dark. This is like superheroes, but just because they have superpowers doesn't necessarily mean they're good people. But yeah, graphic novel, lovely. There was a movie about this, yeah, probably forever ago because I never watch movies, but I do remember that a movie came out about this and it was a fairly popular movie, and it was dark. Like, this shit's dark. This is not 1950s Happy Superman. This is what if superheroes existed, but they were really shitty, normal people with their flaws and just bad behavior that you see in normal people. Next up for 1987, we're getting another. I guess this one can be historical fiction, but it's a completely different type of historical fiction than The Color Purple, and that is Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fanny Flagg. This is on my Bookopalathon TBR, and I said her name was Franny, but it's Fanny. I just can't talk. It's fine, normal, whatever. This is basically this woman goes to visit her mother or aunt or something in a nursing home who has dementia, and while she's there visiting, she meets up with another woman who is in this nursing home who basically tells her life story. And I know there is queer rep in this, where two of the main female characters are in a sapphic relationship. It's probably not spelled out on page because it's the 80s, and yeah, but it's still a fairly obvious, if not like directly stated, sapphic relationship. So I've seen the movie, and I'm excited to read this. This year for me was between this and Misery, and interestingly enough, Kathy Bates starred in both movies, so it was like, which Kathy Bates movie do I want to read? And I just read Too Much Horror last month, and all of it was pretty bad, that I didn't want to do any more horror and went with contemporary / historical fiction. So I lied a little bit about the horror, and for 1988 I am reading a horror novel, but it is a horror novel that I've already read, which when I was a teenager I read it, and B, I know the author, so I'm not like concerned about the writing and afraid that I'm going to get some really creepy rapey scenes in the middle of it. And for 1988 I am reading Queen of the Damned by Anne Rice. I know this is the awful movie cover of the book. It's the copy that I owned. We're gonna go with it. The movie is absolute garbage. The soundtrack to the movie is amazing, but the movie itself is absolute garbage. It was the last movie that Aaliyah starred in before she passed away. That doesn't make the movie any better at all. It is one of the worst movies of all time. Stick to the book and stick to the soundtrack, and just forget that that movie existed. Trust me. But yeah, I read this in high school, which has been almost 20 years, so it's been a while. This copy is actually the copy that I read when I was in high school. This is a very old copy that I've owned myself. But yeah, I'm excited to reread this, and it's basically, what is this about? This is in the middle of a series, so if you're not hugely familiar with Anne Rice's vampires, you're probably not going to know like what's going on in this series. Next up I've got literary fiction, because why not? And I am reading The Remains of the Day by Kazu Ishiguro. This is about a English butler falling in love with a maid, and normally that doesn't sound like anything that I would want to read, but I love Ishiguro's, like the other book that I read by him, which was very misleading in what it was about, which is, oh god, what is the name of that book? Never Let Me Go. Like Never Let Me Go, like the synopsis tells me it's about a boarding school with these like children who are kept away from society, and that is not at all what that book is about. You should read that book, but not know any more about it than what I just told you. But that is not what that book is about. So I'm hoping that this does the same thing, where it's about a butler and a maid falling in love, but I'm going to be like, what the actual fuck is happening through the middle of this book? Like I did with Never Let Me Go. That's the hopes, but I want to go into this blind, so don't ruin it for me in the comments. And the final book for 1990 is The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. Now this is one of the staple, how do I put this, like the staple fantasy series. This is the first book in the Wheel of Time series. There are 15 15 books in the Wheel of Time series. I have read them all. I have read this book in particular probably 15 times. I have like... I have my original copy of it still that is literally falling apart. Like, this is not staying on. Like, the first 20 pages of this are missing. I had to buy a new copy the most recent time I read it just because this is missing half of its pages. But this follows, it's a chosen one trope. A young man named Randall Thor is the dragon reborn, which is probably a spoiler, but it's one of those that it's so freaking obvious from the moment you start reading it that he is the chosen one, that if you actually think that's a spoiler, then yeah, I'm sorry, but you need to get a grip. Basically, he is a young farm boy, and the Dark One, that's really what he's called, sends some minions after him, and then this lovely lady on the cover named Moraine actually shows up to save him. Basically, what happens in this universe is you've got magic users, both male and female, but the male ones are cursed, and if they use their magic, they go insane and, like, destroy things. They'll kill their loved ones, they'll, like, literally break the earth. This main character, Rand, is supposed to be the chosen one, but that means he has to use the magic, which means he's going to go insane. And the, basically all of the books follow his journey through being just a farm boy up to saving the world. This series literally had the worst ending of any book series I've ever read in my entire life. I still like the first 6 books in this series, and then I just kind of like forget the rest of it ever happened is my life goal. But it's been quite a few years since I've reread this, so definitely excited to reread this. It's quite a chunker. It's 600 something pages, but it's not going to take me that long to get through it because it's a reread and I already know what happens in the whole book. And that's everything I have for the 1980s. Leave a comment down below if you have any feedback or questions, comments, problems, suggestions, anything like that. Talk to me about it down in the comments. I would appreciate a like and subscribe if you are willing to give me one. If you like this content, come back and see more, and I will catch you in the next video.